Welcome to today's webcast, How to Implement a New ERP System on Time and on Budget, brought to you by CFO Publishing and by the sponsor of our webcast, Illumiti. I'm Jess Bazzo, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'll cover a few features of the console. On the left-hand side, you'll be able to view slides and polling questions during the webcast. You'll also be able to download a PDF of today's slides by clicking on the link in the resource list icon area. We invite you to ask questions at any time during today's webcast in the Q&A area of your console. You'll also have the opportunity to earn a certificate for 1 CPE credit. To be eligible, you must respond to all 3 polling questions that we'll have throughout the webcast, as well as remain on the line for 50 minutes. After the webcast, if you are eligible to receive credit, you will be able to click on an icon to download the certificate in the certification section. During this webcast, we will discuss how your finance team can take the lead in enabling your organization to complete an ERP implementation on time and on budget. You will learn how to define the scope of your implementation, establish your overall goals and objectives, mitigate challenges and risks that organizations often encounter with ERP implementations, prioritize customizations, and apply a focused simplicity approach to your implementation. Now, I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker, Larry Perlov, President, Illumiti US. Larry is a veteran of high-tech and consulting industries with more than 25 years of international executive-level experience and expertise in ERP and IT. Prior to his current role, Larry was a Senior Vice President at IMG, where he was responsible for IMG's global SAP Business One business unit. I'll now turn things over to Larry. Welcome, Larry. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jess. I am very happy to be here and to discuss this very important topic. So what I'll be focusing on is the topic of implementation on time and on budget, and in particular on the idea of effectively setting initial conditions for a project of this nature. As noted, the target audience for this presentation and webinar are IT and business executives who are considering an ERP project, whether it's a new implementation or an upgrade in the near future. Now, the reason we're having this conversation is because ERP projects have notoriously had a reputation of missing time and budget projections. And what we want to try and accomplish is give you some ideas that will increase the confidence in whatever time and budget projections have been presented without compromising the outcomes of the project. And on this note, I'd like to pause and start with the first polling question.
Great. We will now launch our first polling question. The first question is, when do you anticipate implementing your next ERP system or upgrade? The answers are already complete within the last 12 months, within 1 year, in 1 to 2 years, in 2 to 3 years, in 3 to 4 years, or in 4 or more years. Please take a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder, for those attendees seeking credit for today's webcast, you will need to answer all 3 polling questions. I will leave this question up for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of the attendees to answer, and once I shut this question down, we will share the results and have Larry make a few comments. So I'll leave this up for 1 more second here. And now I'll share the results. Larry, over to you.
Thank you very much. So it looks like there's quite a lot of experience with ERP, and I'm assuming that one of the reasons for participation is that we've had some mixed results with respect to hitting time and budget. Well, the good news and the bad news is that there is no magic wand or silver bullet for hitting time and budget projections. The thing is that there are some key ideas that these are implemented effectively can significantly improve the probability of achieving those reliably. But as you can imagine, there is many reasons why projects slip, whether it's time or budget. And we can probably have a webinar or even a series of webinars on each one. We can talk about methodology, we can talk about resources, we can talk about leadership and sponsorship. There's many reasons why things slip. But the idea I'd like to present today is specifically revolving around scope. How do we effectively set the scope which ensures success? And the concept I'd like to introduce is the concept of minimal viable scope. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the idea of minimal viable, whether it's minimal viable product or minimal viable market. Minimal viable scope is an idea that I'd like to really focus this webinar on. And for those of you who are a little foreign to this, minimal in particular refers to the least or simplest functionality that is required to deliver meaningful outcomes. So both words minimal and viable are important here. We want the least amount of implementation scope to achieve what would be regarded by the organization as a viable implementation, a viable outcome. Why do I choose scope? Well, scope is one of those elements of an implementation that sits right in the middle between success criteria of a project. So when you talk to your fellow stakeholders and you discuss what you want to accomplish with a project, the way you accomplish it is very tightly reflected in the scope of that particular project. And at the same time, scope has a direct impact on the complexity of the project. So then this idea or prevailing point of view is very common. People look at success of a project by effectively delivering a scope for a predefined time and a predefined budget. And when people make commitments, they typically try and achieve all three, even though in many cases there are trade-offs and there is constantly movement between the three. In fact, there is also a prevailing point of view that you have to pick two of the three. You can either deliver scope on time but not on budget. You can deliver scope on budget but not on time, or you can deliver on time and on budget but not deliver the scope that was originally set out to be delivered. Well, I'd like to show you some ideas that might invalidate some of that and give you an empowering set of principles. So when we look at scope in particular, what we want to do is we want to challenge the principles of scope that have materiality, especially on the complexity. And those elements of scope are what we call the integration points. So when you look at scope, when you look at functional scope in particular, there are many areas, when you look at finance, for instance, that can be implemented. But the areas of complexity that are increased are especially relevant when you start talking about the integration points of ERP. Now, that's one of the beauties of ERP. The reason you implement ERP, one of the reasons you implement ERP is because of its ability to integrate. So what some of you might be scratching your head and saying, well, wait a minute, are you telling us that we should be integrating less? I'm suggesting that we should be integrating enough, but the more we integrate, the more integration points we have on a project, the more the complexity increases. And let me share a visual with you. When you look at integration, you have two types of integration. You have vertical integration, and you've got horizontal integration. And overall, it creates this matrix that we're viewing right now. So what do we mean by vertical integration? Well, vertical integration is the value stream of the company. Sales, production, procurement, finance, HR, etc. These are the functional areas that interlink with one another to deliver value to the market, to the customers, and to all stakeholders. Horizontal integration is the organizational integration. So it's the various business units, profit centers, countries, regions, markets. And when we look at the project, let's say, for instance, we wanted to implement ERP in the US. And those are the areas of scope that we would need to implement. This gives us 4 integration points. It gives us sales, procurement, finance, and HR. Within those, there is some additional scope. But at a macro level, the level of complexity of this project seems manageable. If at the same time we wanted to implement Canada as well, and Canada perhaps also added production, it adds another 4 integration points. And those are additive and cumulative. And if we wanted to add the rest of the world, we could possibly look at a picture that looks like this. Now, obviously, the more integration points we add, the more complexity we add. And complexity really has a material impact on our ability to be reliable and predictable and deliver quality. An analogy I'd like to introduce is the analogy of juggling. Imagine we're juggling, and the measurement of on time and on budget is equivalent to the probability of keeping all the balls in the air at the same time. So the number of integration points is equivalent to the number of balls we introduce. When we're juggling 3 balls, the probability of the predictions that we make and the probability of us keeping the balls in the air is fairly high. If we add 1 or 2 more balls, it will increase the complexity, and the probability of us dropping one of those balls will increase. If we add even more, it will increase even more. Now, obviously, juggling is an interesting idea, but hopefully you're getting the point. The more integration points, the more countries, the more functional scope areas that touch one another, the higher the probability that we will make a mistake in our estimations and that we will make a mistake with quality. So the relationship between integration points and the complexity or probability of overrun or missing commitments is not linear, because the more points we add, the level of complexity increases by orders of magnitude. So what are we suggesting? We suggest that instead of talking about scope when we're delivering success on time and on budget, we talk about outcomes. And if you think about it, this is it's a completely different conversation, because as executives, I would argue that you should not really be talking about functional scope that needs to be implemented. You should be talking about outcomes and specifically answer the question why. Why are we doing this project? What outcomes are we going to achieve at the end? When we fast forward 3, 6, 12 months after we go live, what's going to be different about our business? What results are we going to have that are different to the way they are today? And then that will enable those who will be responsible for implementation to determine what is the scope or the functional contents of what is implemented. And because of the ideas of minimal viable scope, we want to follow the principles of less is more. We want to implement as little functional scope as possible and defer what doesn't need to be implemented right now into the future without compromising the outcomes. So whether we want to increase revenues, reduce fixed costs, improve cash flow, improve the reliability of our delivery to the market, those are the principles that we need to be arguing about and saying that this is what we want to deliver in the first phase, and not argue whether we implement HR now or finance and production, or we implement batch level control or traceability to deliver a specific functional scope. Now, this determination of now versus later has some ramifications. By deferring scope to later, it doesn't mean that we're eliminating completely, but we're simplifying the existing project. The thing is that there is really very little downside to deferring scope, because if you think about it, when you've got scope that has been implemented and there is a limited amount of scope that has been implemented, it's always easier to add scope to an existing platform or an existing framework, as opposed to over-implementing and wanting to take it away. If we've implemented something that's not needed now and we want to change our mind and either de-scope it, de-implement it, or make changes, just like a game of Jenga, it can significantly create risk, both for the project as well as for the company. So maintaining a discipline and focus around outcomes creates this whole notion of focused simplicity. We want to focus on outcomes, and we want to create a project where the scope is simple enough, but no simpler, to deliver the viable outcomes that the organization will value and the organization will celebrate. Inevitably, what will happen is the project will be smaller. The project will be less expensive. The project will be faster. And the probability of success will be higher. And so by delivering these quick wins, it enables the organization to build trust, to build momentum, and really start what we look at the success cycle. The success cycle begins with a minimal viable scope. It enables us to realize these business outcomes. These business outcomes being realized, there is no argument that the project is successful. The organization increases its confidence and is ready to fund and invest in additional outcomes, and so they continue to do those. So at this point, I'd like to introduce polling question number 2. So over to you, Jess.
Great. Thank you, Larry. We will now launch our second polling question of the day. The question is, what is your organization's level of experience with ERP projects? The answers are none, very limited, moderate, but haven't had an ERP project in a while, or extensive and recent. Please take a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder, for those attendees seeking credit for today's webcast, you will need to answer all 3 polling questions. This is the second question. I'll leave this poll up for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of the attendees to answer. And like last time, once I shut this question down, we will share the results and have Larry make a few comments. Give everyone one more second here. And Larry, here are the results. Over to you.
Thank you. So, interestingly enough, the majority of participants have got experience but haven't done ERP in a while. And I think if you've done ERP in the last 20 years, in the old days, I've been doing this since the mid-90s. In the old days, there was a push to implement as much as possible, to keep the scope fairly large. There were large, big bangs, and a lot of those projects were difficult. And then we went into the Y2K era, where the projects became smaller and smaller and tighter, and all of a sudden we started delivering them faster and faster, and more of them were delivered on time. Now, in real time, I remember thinking that it was because we had more experience. But now that I look at it back and I have done all of this research, to me it's pretty clear that the reason why those projects were more successful and more reliable is because they were smaller and simpler. We were forced to deliver on time. There wasn't really an option. So that's very interesting. Thank you all for your feedback. Okay, so why do projects overrun, right? So, of course, I'm making the argument that they overrun because we have too much complexity or unnecessary complexity. But I'd like to maybe share a couple of ideas or make sure that we're on the same page with respect to how project scheduling and budgeting is structured. So a project timeline is made up of major phases. Phases are made up of activities. And when you look at a typical activity, it's made up of 2 periods of time. There is the touch time, and then there is the safety. Now, people who've been doing something over and over for many years don't really separate a type of activity into touch time and safety. They know how long it takes them to do something, and they just give us a number. But even if they've got experience, in their head, they're doing this calculation without even realizing it. Touch time is the amount of time it actually physically takes someone to perform a task, to perform the task, and the safety is the amount of time we add in case there is an unforeseen circumstance or some sort of a contingency. Now, as consultants, we always face the dilemma of managing the safety because the touch time, frankly, is really not negotiable, especially when someone is experienced. I know how long it takes them to perform the task if they're not interrupted and if the stars align and everything is perfect. So the variable itself is the safety. So in the bidding process, on the one hand, we want to give the customer a reliable estimate, an estimate that will be met. But if we do that, if we're too reliable, then we push the estimate to the right of this bell curve. And as we go into the right of this bell curve, we're going to the red because we are perceived to be too expensive. And if we want to be too aggressive and we want to try and win the business, well, it's going to be a one and done for us because we're going to give an estimate that's way too aggressive, deliver way over time and over budget, and we will not have the ability to maintain a relationship with the customer. And by the way, this same dilemma is faced by probably yourselves and your colleagues because you have to give estimates to the various other stakeholders who have to believe that what you're giving them is right. And again, you don't want to give a number that's too big, and you don't want to give a number that's too small. So our objective is to figure out what is the appropriate amount of time to give. And by the way, the less the complexity of the scope, the higher the probability that we'll be in the green, that we can give a reasonable safety, a reasonable estimate, without the probability of missing it. So, in effect, as we head into the estimation phase, we're walking a tightrope. And what we see all the time is inevitably we make the mistake, because there's so many projects that go over time and over budget. The mistake that is made is we underestimate. We give too little time and too little budget for safety against an amount of scope that is probably too large. So clearly a minimal viable scope will help eliminate it, but then we have to ask ourselves, if this makes sense, why aren't people doing it? Why aren't companies doing it? Why aren't companies minimizing the amount of scope that they try and implement? And I believe the answer lies in two factors. The two main reasons why minimal viable scope is difficult is the licensing model of ERP and the fear of the single initiative. So let me talk about both. In order to share with you why the way ERP is licensed, I'd like to introduce a second analogy, and this is the analogy of the desired meal. So let's suppose that we're chefs and we want to prepare a gourmet meal for one of our clients. And in order to prepare this gourmet meal, we buy a license for the ingredients. We buy a license for the scope of what we're going to be implementing. And this license is a magical shopping cart. This is a magical shopping cart that enables us to walk into any grocery store and buy any one of the ingredients that are on the shelf that we want. All of this is included in our license. So inevitably, we have the two pressures. On the one hand, we know we want to cook this gourmet meal and we want this to be beautiful and delicious. And on the other hand, this magical shopping cart is quite expensive. And because we have access to all of these groceries and all of these ingredients, we have pressure to try and buy as many ingredients as we can. So off we go. We start rushing up and down the aisles and we start grabbing groceries because we want to maximize the value of this meal. And because usually the pressure to maximize value is deemed in how much we cook and how many groceries we're able to incorporate, we buy too many groceries. We try and cook this meal with more groceries than we actually need. And instead of cooking a beautiful and elegant and delicious meal, we end up cooking a pot full of slop. And in general, because it was so much more complex, this is not a very delicious meal. The outcome is missed, and it takes us longer and more expensive to incorporate all of those ingredients into the meal. Now, obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but I hope that the message is received. Because ERP gives us the ability to implement pretty much everything that's included in the license, we feel pressure to implement as much of it as possible because we feel like we've paid for it, we might as well use it. The second reason for why minimal viable scope is difficult is the fear of one bite of the apple. So what this means is that many companies, and I would assume that some of you on this call have probably experienced this, don't have a follow-on ERP implementation. You implement ERP, it's difficult, it's painful, and at the end, you're one and done. You have one bite of the apple, and so this one bite of the apple is caused by the miss cycle. So this is the opposite of the success cycle. We pick a big scope, we end up paving the cow paths. By the way, in many cases, the big scope is driven by the fact that we currently do things in a certain way, and we want to repeat. We want to keep the things that we like about our current system, so we implement a lot of what we have today. So we pave these cow paths. We do not deliver expectations. We actually don't deliver an improvement in outcomes, and we go over time and over budget because of the complexity of the project. We reduce the organization's confidence in our ability to deliver, and we have no appetite to invest anymore. So because of that, there is a feeling that I have to implement everything. I have to do it once because I'm only going to get one shot at the title. So coming out of that, I'd like to reaffirm the argument that if we do this right and we keep the scope small enough where the probability of hitting both outcomes and time and budget is high, it'll give us the ability of fulfilling this prophecy where success begets success. We're successful, we deliver value, and then the rest of the organization has confidence in us and wants to continue investing. A third principle I'd like to introduce you to is a model that we use to ensure that the level of scope and risk is maintained, and that is our tornado deployment model. So this tornado approach looks at scope and says, the scope is actually a function not only of the functionality, but also of the organizational units that receive that scope. And essentially, the total scope that we implement it can be represented as this square. And imagine that we have 4 or 5 organizations that have to implement ERP, and each of them have got slightly different requirements. The area under this square, or under this curve, represents the cost and the risk and the complexity of a given project. So the more functionality we implement, the more organizations we implement, it's a topic du jour of today. It's the biggest driver of the complexity and the risk of the project. Now, our argument is don't implement everything at once. Make some choices about what to implement first, second, and third. And one of the reasons for that is not every organization needs all the functionality. And so the argument that we have is we're better off starting off with a small, quick win, an organization that can benefit from certain finite functionality, and build from that and the overall implementation approach will end up looking like a tornado by doing the following. So release 1 could be this red area, and then release 2 would be a layering on top of the red area of 1.1, but because we're effectively establishing a template for 1.1, 1.2, the blue area is a lot easier to implement because we already have all the building blocks that we're essentially copying and leveraging. And the only thing that's new is a little piece of red to the right of 1.2. Then 1.3 follows the same principle, and 1.4 follows the same principle. And when all is said and done, we've implemented all of the scope, but the risk is almost half, because half of this area under the curve is unfilled. Now, this is just a graphical representation. The actual measurement of cost and risk is probably not going to follow this exact principle, but I hope the idea is clear. We want to balance the organization's ability to absorb the change, but in each of these implementations, in each of these releases, we're delivering incremental value, and the organization isn't taking on unnecessary risk, both from a time and budget perspective, but also in its ability to actually realize the outcomes. And all of this is possible because our outcome is the true north. Challenging ourselves to ensure that the outcome is true north is really the most critical aspect of the thesis of what I'm presenting today. Without a clear outcome, it's impossible to deliver a minimal viable scope. And it becomes really an exercise in trying to implement what we have today. And then inevitably we fall into the trap of implementing too much, fearing that we will only have one shot at it. And at the end of the day, the results are going to be left to chance. So all of this can be summarized in we want successes, we want to build upon successes, and of course, since I'm from Boston, I'm going to take some liberties and talk about winning championships by winning one championship at a time and not trying to go for a home run right out of the gate. At this time, I'd like to present the third and final polling question.
Great. Thank you, Larry. We will now launch our third and final polling question, as Larry mentioned. The question is, what do you feel are the greatest obstacles to implementing a new ERP system in your business? The answers are understanding the benefits and desired outcomes, convincing our leadership team, determining scope, finding the budget, or finding the right implementation partner. Again, please take a few moments to select your answer. Again, as a reminder for those attendees seeking credit for today's webcast, you will need to answer all 3 polling questions, and this is the last one. I'll leave this poll up for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of the attendees to answer. And again, like last time, once I shut this question down, we will share the results and have Larry make a few comments. I'll now share the results. Larry, over to you.
So that's interesting. Understanding outcomes and determining scope are the majority winners here, and obviously that's the thesis of our discussion. I will tell you that in my experience, probably the toughest one is the outcomes, and of course, without outcomes, we always tend to overestimate the amount of scope that we want to implement. So I'm glad to see that we have some level of consistency here, and hopefully you guys have some questions for me that will enable me to maybe dive a little bit deeper into it. So that's my thesis. I'd like to summarize that outcomes are key. If we don't have clarity on outcomes, it's almost impossible to get the scope right. And what I mean by right is the delivery of something that's going to be of value to the company. Many projects have an outcome of replacement of an existing system. Well, if that's our outcome, inevitably the scope that we will choose to implement is everything that we have today. But is that really necessary? Sometimes it is, and in many cases it is. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes we need to change what we implement, challenge our rules, challenge our processes, and in the process it will enable us to effectively go to the second point of my summary, which is the minimal viable scope. Implement less, it's less expensive, the probability of winning, the probability of delivering what we said we were going to deliver is much, much higher, and the organization overall benefits from it. The tornado approach is an idea that you should keep in the back of your mind as a sequencing model. Not everything needs to be implemented at once. In fact, the more projects we do, the more agile we want to be. The whole idea of sprints, the whole idea of not waterfalling these projects, but letting them sprint, delivering bite-sized chunks, bite-sized batches that have value, delivering them fast, delivering them with higher confidence and higher probability of success. All of that enables us to build momentum. This momentum is going to enable the organization to truly benefit from the investment in ERP. And at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. That's how we celebrate success. We used to say that delivering on time and on budget is a given. We have to do that. The problem with projects is that they don't deliver the outcomes. They don't deliver the outcomes that the organization set out to deliver. Because, I mean, if you think about it, if you had to choose between outcomes and being on time and on budget, what's better, to deliver poor outcomes on time and on budget, or deliver great outcomes but going over time and over budget? Obviously, our goal is to do both. But what we've now realized is that they're linked. In order to deliver outcomes, we have to minimize the scope, and that will enable us to deliver on time and on budget. At least that's one of the key drivers for delivering on time and on budget. As I said, this is just one idea. This is just setting the initial conditions. It is by no means the be-all and end-all of delivering these projects. There are many other prerequisites. There are many other necessary conditions that have to exist for projects to successfully be delivered. But if we get this part right, it sets us up for success. So now we have some time for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Larry. We are now going to review some of the questions that were submitted by the audience during the session. As a reminder, you can still submit questions to Larry via the Q&A section of the interface. Larry, our first question is, how can one accurately estimate customized systems? There aren't that many out-of-the-box ERP implementations out there.
Say again, so how can someone accurately estimate customized systems?
Yes.
Okay. So I think what the question is referring to, how can we determine if the system can meet our needs? So I'm going to make that assumption because I can't get feedback. But in other words, how do we determine whether the system will meet the requirements of the company? Again, the beauty of asking the outcome question is it forces us to express the outcome in measurable business terms and then disaggregate it into capabilities that have to be fulfilled in order to achieve that outcome. Once we have clear view of capabilities, then and only then can we start talking about whether or not the ERP can fulfill that capability. The leap is too large to go from functional capabilities of an ERP, functional scope of ERP, to the outcome. So my recommendation is to define the outcomes, define them in measurable, specific terms, disaggregate them into clear capabilities, such as we need to be able to run MRP on a daily basis, we need to be able to have visibility to which customers are profitable and which customers are not profitable. We need to be able to express all of these parameters in capability terms and then do an evaluation of whether the ERP can actually deliver those specific capabilities. Believe it or not, there are more and more ERPs that are becoming out of the box again. The push for cloud, the push for software as a service is forcing the software providers to deliver systems that are fit for purpose out of the box. And so the question is, it's incumbent upon the finance leaders and the business leaders to make the evaluation, but do it on the basis of apples to apples by looking at outcomes as a primary true north.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Our next question is minimal viable synonymous with agile?
No. They're close, but minimal viable basically says, to me at least, the way I think about it is, what is the least amount of scope I need to deliver the outcome for a given phase of the project or a given time in the life cycle of the company. We are moving more and more to agile in delivering these projects in this manner, but minimal viable is simply a statement of what is the least amount of scope that I can implement to deliver the outcome, period, the end. Whether I use agile methodology or waterfall methodology to deliver that, that's a different topic. But the statement of minimal viable, it's along the same line of thought as agile, but I wouldn't call it synonymous.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Our next question is, would you suggest one module at a time? For example, estimating, then customer, later accounting?
No. I think that would be kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm not suggesting go down to absolute minimum. That's why I have the words minimal and viable. In order to be viable, we have to implement components of the system that will deliver end-to-end business results. So I'm not suggesting implement finance alone, then implement sales, then estimating, then production. No. That would be a mistake. What we want to do is we want to deliver those components of the system that will give the results, that will empower the company to improve right out of the gate, but keep it smaller than what would be typically viewed as an approach. So in other words, the power of ERP is integration. So we would definitely want integration. We're going to be juggling balls. I'm just suggesting that we juggle 4 or 5 balls and not 20 balls. That's all. So it's about implementing the right level of complexity to deliver the value and the viability of the project.
Great. Thank you. Our next question is, what are some of the pre-existing conditions that you referred to at the end of the summary that must exist in order to accurately deliver outcomes on time and on budget? So obviously the estimation itself has to be good. The level of confidence we have in our estimates is also a function of complexity. So by limiting the complexity of the project, of course, is a huge pre-existing condition. You have to have a sound methodology. You have to have the right team. You have to have the right skills. You have to have the right client engagement, dedicated resources when needed. There are many things. I did not prepare a whole inventory of all the items that have to be in place. Some of these are
potentially negotiable. Some of these have got larger level of importance depending on the project and depending on the circumstance. But my argument is that if you put too much scope on the table, and really maybe that's sort of the essence of everything I'm trying to communicate today. If you take on too much scope, it doesn't really matter how strong your team is and how wonderful your methodology is. The probability of you missing the commitments that you're making is higher because you're just taking on too much complexity. So that to me is probably the most important pre-existing condition. If you would like to have more clarity on other areas, I'm more than happy to communicate offline and share some other specific areas of that have to pre-exist for success.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is, how critical is a detailed project plan in the project success, whether large scale or sprint specific?
Sorry, ask the question again, please, Gareth.
Sure. The question is, how critical is a detailed project plan in the project success, whether large scale or sprint specific?
Oh, I think it's very important. You have to have a good project plan. The project plan, and especially when you talk about details, what resonates with me is the level of attention we give to the amount of safety that we build into our estimates. If the higher level the plan, i.e. if it's not detailed, if it's a level 2 or a level 3 on a plan that should be at a level 5, inevitably you're going to make some simplifying assumptions around how much safety you're putting in. So I would say it's very important. It's very important to have a good plan.
Great. Our next question is, many companies today are looking to reduce overhead and increase efficiency in areas like accounting through software as a service and business process outsourcing. Is that too narrow of an approach when considering ERP implementations?
I don't think so. I think that's a good place to start. If the idea is to reduce overhead or fixed costs, that's a perfectly fine objective. If it's straight up in accounting, see, like if you think about even improving accounting costs or accounting efficiencies, accounting touches pretty much every other aspect of the business. So if we're going to be touching accounts receivable, we're also going to be touching the sales department and the way we process sales orders, all the way from the customer all the way down to the actual receipt of cash. Then we've got cash management and treasury. We've got accounts payable and touching of purchasing. We've got costing and the touching of production. So I don't have a problem at all at starting with costs. In fact, I would say that's probably the most prevailing reason for customers implementing ERP. They want efficiency. They want shared services. They want standardization of process for the purpose of reducing cost. My personal preference is to see companies that put targets on the table that are growth-oriented, such as revenue, market share, improved service levels, reduction of lead times, improvement of reliability and delivery of product and service to the market. Those are much more exciting to me personally, but looking for opportunities to reduce costs is absolutely fine. I don't think it's too narrow an approach. It's a great place to start. What you'll find, though, is when you start there and you start unbundling that and start needling it, you'll find that there are other outcomes that are equally important that should be on the table and are worth discussing as well.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Our next question is, how can you define an intermediate scope that can be increased later without having to go to an entirely new system?
That's an excellent question. I would say that it's probably best to lay out again the outcomes and start talking about when you're talking about outcomes. I like the approach of a SMART outcome setting, right? So it's specific, measurable, attainable, time-bound, and results-oriented. And the time-bound aspect of the outcome is really important. So the question is, what do we want to achieve, and when do we want to achieve it? And what you'll find with current ERPs, systems like SAP or Microsoft, they're extremely functionally rich. So the probability of needing to switch to a new system because the scope changes is probably quite low. In fact, sometimes it's too intoxicating. There are so many things we want and feel like we could use that we want to implement right away. So my suggestion is lay out your outcome plan, which should be aligned to your business plan or your overall company strategy over time for the next 3 to 5 years. Disaggregate those outcomes into capabilities that the company needs. Those capabilities will then lead us to what processes and what areas of scope do we need to have automation in to enable those capabilities and subsequently those outcomes. So having an intermediate scope is absolutely brilliant. In fact, this is even easier to do when you've got a larger organization with a global footprint, because it's very, very dangerous to take on too many organizational units. I mean, those were mistakes of the past where we had massive big bang global projects that were very expensive and had big overruns. And by breaking it up into geographic regions, those are the obvious ways to break scope down. But even when you look at it, you know, if I go back to my tornado slide, is it okay if I do that, Jess?
Yep, absolutely.
Let me quickly go back to my tornado slide. And as you can see, the idea with a tornado is you have an intermediate scope for 1.1, then you deliver 1.2, and you're leveraging 1.1, and you're adding the red to the side of 1.2. Now, once you've implemented 1.2, you can quite easily retrofit that back to 1.1. And similarly with 1.3. So if you need 1.2 functionality in 1.1, you can just drop that down. I did not illustrate it on the slide. So whoever asked this question, the thing is that you have an intermediate scope 1.1. It's what you need now to deliver the functionality for this organization. When you do your next release, you're already thinking about what you're going to be doing for 1.2 when you're planning 1.1. So I'm not suggesting that you ignore what you need to do for 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, but you just implement now what you need now. This keeps the project tight, the budget small, the complexity lower, and the probability of success higher. So, I mean, look, you might face a situation where you make some decisions, you have an intermediate scope, you go through a deployment path, and then 5 years later, you've acquired a new company, you've gone into a new market, and you need functionality that your current ERP can't deliver. But you would never have been able to predict that. As long as you know what your goals are and what objectives you have, the ability to actually roll this out and retrofit back functionality that's implemented in later phases of the tornado is very viable, and it's proven to be very effective in many circumstances.
Excellent. Thanks, Larry. Our final question of the day is, what's the role of the consulting partner in helping define minimal viable scope?
Well, I would say that a consulting partner needs to challenge the executives of the company to truly effectively articulate the outcomes that they want and push back on the scope. Now, consulting partners will often face this dilemma because when a customer is asking for a lot of stuff, it could be very appealing to a consultant who then looks at it and says, it's a lot of stuff, it'll take a long time, and I'm in business to generate services revenues, so this is very attractive. And oftentimes they don't push back. So a good consulting partner needs to push back. You need to see the consulting partner as somebody who will actually argue with you. They're going to argue with you and say, we need to implement less, we need to keep the budget smaller because we want to align to a specific outcome, and overall, almost a constructive dissonance is what you're looking for. The consulting partner needs to push back. He or she needs to challenge you to clearly define your outcomes and build a scope around those outcomes, and not simply accept your scope as a given and just go for it. If you have a lot of experience and you know exactly what you want and why you want it, then the consulting partner should still challenge you, but at the end of the day, comply with your desires and implement what you want them to implement. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you. Larry, we want to thank you again for a wonderful session. I know many of our attendees asked about Larry's slides today, so as a reminder, they can be downloaded as a PDF by clicking on the link in the resource list area. We invite you to complete an online feedback survey. The feedback survey will appear in a separate browser window once we close down the event. As always, we appreciate your feedback and your time today. Thank you, everyone.